Hi, I'm Peter Hyman, Chair of the Boys Education Commission. Welcome to Boy Talk, a series of honest conversations with fascinating people about the challenges facing boys and young men. Today I'm speaking to Sana Khareghani. Sana has more than 25 years' experience in technology and business across the private and public sectors. With a degree in computer science and an MBA from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, Sana has worked as a software engineer in big corporations and startups, as a strategy consultant advising C-suite clients globally, and as the first head of the UK government's Office for AI, publishing the UK's national AI strategy. Sana is currently Chief Strategy Officer at Era4, which is an AI infrastructure company delivering low-carbon, high-performance capacity to enable the UK AI transformation. She's also a Professor of Practice in AI at King's College London and an AI policy lead for Responsible AI UK, and is a trustee of the Institute for the Future of Work. But you're also on the Boys Education Commission. But I think you will agree there's no one better to talk about, in particular, the future of jobs, the AI impact, and what young people will face in the future. So welcome, Sana.
Thank you very much, Peter, for having me.
Good. Well, let's start. I ask all the men what they were like as a boy growing up. So I'm going to ask you what it was like as a girl growing up, and also with your interactions with boys. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, of course, I can do that. To start off with an easy one. So I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia, so I'm Canadian. So maybe bring a little different perspective. But growing up, I was different. I tended to kind of maximize on the things I enjoyed. I was really good at maths, and I ended up going into computer science after some discussions and disagreements with the guidance counselor who was supposed to help us with our careers. Because I originally went to her and said, I want to do chemistry. And she said, you don't want to work in a lab all your life. And then I said, okay, well, how about a lawyer? I'm really good at arguing. And she said, no, you'll be divorced by the time you're 40. I mean, this was the bit of advice I had from her, and so I
Wow.
kind of walked away thinking, what do I do? And at the time, all the money and all of the hype was around computers. And I thought, well, I'm going to get a job. At least I'll know I'll get a job. And you need to be good at maths to do this. And so I went in there and I really loved it. It was all about kind of logic puzzles and solving puzzles like that. And so I went into it and really quite blindly to who else was doing it. And I didn't actually even notice that there were so few women, having been in maths anyway in high school and stuff like that. There was always not that many women. And so when I graduated, there was 20 women who graduated with me out of a class of about 250. In computer science. So it was not very many. And then when I went to MIT, MIT used to boast about the number of women in our class, which sat around 30%. In fact, I had an interesting conversation with the first job I had was I was interviewed by a man who had graduated also from MIT, but many years before. And he said that, when he asked me how many women were in my class, and I said, we've got about 30% women, he said, in my day, there was one woman and she wore army boots and smoked a cigar. And so, as far as he was concerned, we had come a long way. But obviously 30% women is, not that great. So my relationship has always been, I've always kind of had very close relationships with men and boys growing up in terms of from colleagues and friendships and so on. And so growing up, I had to learn how to have relationships with women, which is not typical.
Yeah. And what's your explanation, having been in that male-dominated field, and this still happens in schools? People have tried a lot to get more girls into STEM subjects, into maths, into computer science, and there has been some progress, as you've just said. But what is it that makes some subjects more male dominated, some more female? What do you think underlies it?
It's such an interesting question, and I have spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think there's a lot of culture involved in this, because if you look at Eastern culture, you don't see the same sort of trends over there, whether it's the Middle East or in Asia. Um, Women tend to take a lot of engineering and math subjects without any of the stigma, whereas in the West, there does seem to be a bit of culture that leads, and to socially acceptable subjects for boys and girls. Um, and it's a vicious circle, because the fewer women you see in these subjects, then the fewer women go into them as well and come out of them. And so it does tend to be this kind of role of a woman type of thing. But because I guess the other point around this is that in single sex schools, you find that actually boys and girls tend to follow a little bit more their interests rather than what's socially or culturally accepted. So I think culture plays a big role in that. Um, but like you said, we're changing things. I just wish it was changing a lot faster.
And that you mentioned single sex schools, and I know that's often a contrast between there are more of them in Britain than there are in either Canada or the United States.
Yeah.
What do you think that's a good thing, single sex education, or how do you contrast the two?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think single sex education and also wearing uniforms in state funded schools are both things that are very different, or at least in my experience have been very different from my own experience growing up, and also nieces and nephews that I have in the U.S. and Canada. Um, and I think both of them there are some merits to both, and one around single sex schools especially, there is this idea that removing kind of societal stigma and cultural kind of directions means that children follow their interests more, rather than what's acceptable, socially acceptable, and what other friends are doing or tend to be doing. So when you're in with a bunch of girls, the data at least shows that um, girls tend to pursue their interests more, rather than being in a room full of smelly boys who are also doing computer science, right? And so this is that's the kind of the positioning, and at least what we've seen now. Personally, I think society is men and women, and so I think you miss out on the fact that you need to be able to interact with both sexes. And so there's a question mark in my head whether single sex schools is the right answer to solving one problem whilst potentially causing others. Um, but uniforms, I would say I'm a convert. I think in Canada, in state schools, I mean less so in private schools, but in state schools for sure, uniforms are not a thing. Everybody wears their own clothes every day, and that does create a definite kind of hierarchy of have and have not, and it's very, very obvious whose families are well off, who's got the branded clothing, what sort of socioeconomic background the children come from. And so you almost kind of get pigeonholed before you've opened your mouth there. And so I think, uniforms here kind of level the playing field, and means that children start from the same position. And so yes, I'm absolutely converted. I wasn't to start off with, but I'm absolutely converted on the uniform front.
On uniform, I go back and forward. As a head teacher starting a new school, we had this great debate about, I don't really believe in uniform, but I think like you, it's a great leveler. I think my own three children are probably some of the only in the country that went through 4 to 18 in state schools never wearing a uniform,
Oh
because
wow.
both their primary and their secondary didn't believe in them.
Oh,
So
interesting.
it's quite, and they quite liked it. And actually, you're right. There's some people wear more expensive and branded, but actually, there's probably almost their own uniform of just wearing t-shirt and trousers that probably transcends. So it's a very interesting debate. And whether boys rebel, given that we're talking about boys, whether boys rebel more about uniform than girls, I think probably that's about even. But tell me, I mean, you fought for equality in the different sectors that you've been in, particularly for women who, as you've said already, have been underrepresented. What's made you now interested in boys' education and how boys and men are doing?
Um, you're right. I mean, I've kind of championed women all my career. I'm a mentor. I speak on behalf of women. I try to show by doing. I'm a mother. I have a career, um, and I like to show that it's okay. You can have this balance, and you can't do it all by yourself. You need a support
Mm.
network as well. Um, but as you said, I'm now moving into this space, and it doesn't mean that I stop continuing to
Mm.
champion women, but I want to start thinking about boys as well. So I guess there's two reasons for me. One is simply I have a son and a daughter, and so I think I don't want one or the other of them to look back and say, mommy didn't fight for me. So that's part of the reason. But also, I can see that if we don't try and fix some of the endemic issues that we're seeing, we end up creating a society in the future that we don't want to be in, that we don't want to live in. If our boys today um, aren't feeling fulfilled and aren't fulfilling their own abilities, um, they don't have the access to the right types of mentors, or they're not driven to achieve in the various sectors that exist for them, and achieve to their potential, then society has failed them, and they will then fail society, and that's not a future any of us want to be in. So whether it's boys or girls. So I think, from that kind of balanced perspective, it's really, really important that we get this right. Right. I think to add that up, I've had a number of conversations with various people since, I've taken up this role. And because I think it's such an important question, and everyone has seen and felt that this is happening. And a friend of mine recently said that there is something about this movement of championing women and the history of why that has happened and why we've all felt the need to do so, right? Which means that the younger generation of boys who are coming into this space without any of that historical hindsight to help them understand why there is this difference means that they feel almost a void, right? And we haven't filled that void properly. And so I think a commission like this will help us try and understand some of the factors around that void, why various figures have moved into that void and then exploited it to their own benefits, for example, and how we're failing boys and what we can do to fix it, right? Because otherwise we will end up with a society which goes full circle, and we'll have, boys who mistreat women and girls, and we end up back where we started. So we need to have this balance.
That's really interesting. And maybe explain a bit more this idea of a void. Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, I'm just thinking about the kind of difference. So if you take younger boys who come into the world looking at, girls being championed, girls being pushed forward, girls being pushed towards these, subjects, and we're not doing the same thing for boys, right? And that's because history has shown us that women don't go into these fields, and we
Yeah,
need to
yeah.
drive them. And they don't have that historical
Mm.
hindsight to explain why it is that they're not being pushed. Because the expectation is they'll just go into it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
this group needs pushing. And what they see is, I, they're not asking me to do anything, but they're pushing this other, and so I think the reason it makes sense, and the reason that we should continue to do it, and it's important to do it, is because we know that if we don't, we end up with this imbalance. But I think what's happened is we have created a void where this new generation who's come in doesn't have the benefit of hindsight about
Yeah.
why this is happening, right? And so what they have is role models who then exploit it. So Andrew Tate being a good example, who says, right, yeah, this is why you're being left behind. This is what you need to do. You need to step up and be a man and demand your position in society. And actually, that's not at all what, that's not at all the void that we are meaningfully leaving behind, right? And we need to be able to fill that properly. And I think and this is, this happens in everything that society tries to fix, right? We push one side, we forget about the balance, there's an imbalance, it shifts, and we come back to an equilibrium. I think in a situation like this, we don't want to come back to an equilibrium that takes us to the past and we have to relive the cycles again. I think we need to recognize that there is this void and we need to understand why, and we need to fill it appropriately.
That's really, really interesting. And it chimes in with a theme that head teachers have talked to me about almost the expectations in schools they're finding are lower of boys than of girls, because there's a real sense, as you've just said, of pushing the girls, and sometimes there's almost excuses made for boys, or there's an expectation subliminally of teachers that they're not going to achieve as well. So it's quite it's quite interesting.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I don't know whether it's because the expectation is that they won't achieve as well. I think the expectation has always been, well, boys will go into maths and computer science because that's what they've always done,
Mm.
And I don't know. We need to
No,
push the girls into the STEM subjects. We don't need to push the boys into the, so, well, maybe we do.
and it's wider than STEM, of course. It's
It's
about the
wider than STEM. Of course it is. That's right.
expectation of boys generally at school. So that's really interesting. Well, let's get into, I mean, and this is obviously an area of expertise, the whole technology and AI, and people are very alarmist, at least a lot of them, about the labour market and what's going to happen. So maybe just paint a bit of a picture of what you think is happening at the moment and what might happen. I know we can't predict with any great certainty, but give me maybe a flavour of what you think the things we need to think about are.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the labor market changing is obviously going to affect everyone in society, regardless of their kind of gender or
Yeah, of
or,
course.
or orientation or whatever, right? What we're seeing is that artificial intelligence technologies are coming in, and they are very good at automating certain bits of work, and that tends to be the kind of what I call the lower rung of the ladder, right? Every kind of work that we do in society is in an apprenticeship model, as in you come in at the bottom rung and then you learn the tricks of the trade and you move up, and then you get someone else under you and you kind of move up this ladder, and that's everything from education and doctors to business, finance, law, whatever trades, right? Creative, anything, right? Sous chefs, right?
Yeah.
In every kind of work that we do, we have this idea. And what's happening now, and the trend that we're seeing, is that these technologies are automating the kind of, that they're automating what the paralegals used to do. So go out and do the research, or what an analyst might do in a consulting firm, or what a creative might do when they first come into a company. And these bottom rung jobs tend to be the early career people who come into a company. And so what we're seeing is that it is becoming more difficult. And some of this is very early days, right? We are seeing some layoffs and people rehiring back again because they did it too soon. We're also seeing a little bit of a shift of early career folk not having as many job opportunities as they might have, say, a decade ago. But what that means is that if we're losing that kind of the bottom of the pyramid, and as you go up this pyramid, you're gaining experience and you're moving and you start to become, the expert in your field. The question becomes, how do we train our future experts,
Mm.
right? And so the worry about the labor market, there's I guess multiple worries. One is, if the adoption of these technologies goes as quickly as we think, are we going to have a reckoning where there are more jobs destroyed than created, right? Because over time we have generally seen that new technology creates more jobs than it destroys, but that takes a period of time.
Mm.
So the one worry is if we're moving up that curve much more quickly than the jobs there are that are created, are we going to create a space of time when we have too much unemployment? So that's the first one. The second is what I was talking about, creating kind of future experts, right? If we're removing, without thoughtfully thinking this through, all of the bottom rung of the ladder, and we're bringing, there's huge competition for people who are already experts, then we're getting this wrong. So how are we going to create future experts as these ones start to retire and leave the workforce, right? You're creating an imbalance again. So these are I guess a couple of the trends and questions that we have to think about and watch as we go through this. And there's obviously ways on doing this better.
And if we look at education, which is our focus, and what should happen in schools, then, you could argue things in a lot of different ways. You could argue that those things are going to depend on relationships in the future, of which certain roles and certain jobs are, about what's often called the softer skills, or that's a terrible term. I always think they're hard skills. You could argue the trades will be less threatened immediately, plumbing and electrician, all the rest, than some of the professional jobs where the bottom rungs are already being taken away. So what do you see as the implications for how we prepare people for this world in school? What should we focus on?
Well, this is another one that, you wish you had a crystal ball, right? Because I think there is one of the reasons the national curriculum across the world hasn't really seen any drastic changes over time is because if you get it wrong, you're not going to know about it for 30 years, right? And so nobody is really truly brave enough to make the big drastic changes they think they need to make, right? But if I were, betting on something, I guess I would say critical thinking comes in as the most important thing. We have to teach our children how to be able to think critically through the information that they have, to be inquisitive, to neither be over reliant on a piece of technology blindly, or under reliant, right? So you have to be kind of just right, because you can imagine if we essentially just do as the computer says, without any critical thinking and inquisitive mind, then we're removing the human from the loop. And I don't think that's the right answer. These are tools that are helping to augment us, make us better, make us more than we individually are, right? But not to replace us. But if we're under reliant on it, then we're spending all this huge amount of money on an innovation that can help augment us and make us better at what we do. And instead of actually using it, we inquire about every time it tells us to do something that's beyond the thing that we had thought about ourselves, and we go away and we research it for 15 years and we come back realizing, well, actually it was right, we could have saved ourselves all that time. So you've got this kind of balance that you need to have. But I do think that critical thinking is at the basis of all of this. And I would say this, I think, math's for everyone all the time, right? Because I think, the bottom of all of this is yeah. But that's something I would say.
But just to challenge, there's other things I wanted to pick up on. On the maths, you could say, again, it slightly depends what sort of maths. You need a facility with maths. But obviously, one of the great things about AI and technology is it's got immense computing power. And some of the maths taught in school, although of course you need the foundations of number, are doing the routine stuff rather than the more problem solving. So there's debates even within maths, aren't there, as well?
Oh, absolutely. And and that'll send us down a rabbit hole very quickly. But yes, I think you obviously need the foundations, but a lot less of the cursory stuff, a lot more about the kind of broader problem landscape definition. That's the bits that I think are helpful for students. And look, I think we do this, right? There's a question of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? So I think we have to give some credit to the education system that has gotten us to here, right? These things haven't been created without people at driving them, right? So we've gotten some things right. I think there needs to be some bravery in trying out new things, in getting it wrong and trying again. But also remembering that a lot of the things that we teach our children on how to think, not what to think, but how to think, is really, really important. We got to keep doing that.
That's really interesting. If we take the example which is most familiar in AI to most people, which is the large language models and everyone using their ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, I had some really interesting conversations with young people in schools who were really thoughtful about whether it actually stopped their learning process because it's so rapid. If you put it in ChatGPT, then you haven't had to make your own mistakes, as you just mentioned. And so,
Yeah.
what is the role of those large language models in the school system? There are some on the one hand who might ban them altogether. There are
Yeah.
others who say, well, use them in a clever way. Well, what's your take on it?
I think this is one that I think the creativity of teachers will find the answer for us, right? But I guess I would go back to the bravery question. I think teachers need to look at these and need to think about how they can use them as a tool to help with critical thinking and help their students almost level up to using these. So if this is the bottom rung, how do I add that extra bit on top to demonstrate that I have deeper understanding than where this got me? A couple of examples that I've heard, or these are all anecdotal, of course, because no real studies have happened on these yet. Is I've had I, I really liked, for example, there was one professor who said that, or he was actually a teacher in secondary school, would set an essay question, would, instead of setting the essay question and handing that out, would actually give the students the essay that one of the large language models had written on the essay question they had set. And so that would be the answer. Here is the essay that here's one I produced the night before via one of these large language models.
Yeah.
I now want you to take that up to the next level. I want you to argue the points. I want you to go one level deeper. I want you to figure out, and this could be that they go back to the large language models and they use prompts to understand more or better. They can go to other sources. They then have to employ this idea of this isn't the final answer.
Yeah.
Right. So you kind of you don't start from a blank slate. And I think that's what these large language models are. Whereas, we used to, in the analog days, start with a blank slate and you had to start putting stuff in, and then you were 60% there quite quickly. But it was that next level that kind of differentiated the grades in the classroom. You're now going, well, look, what we've got is the level playing field. You're all getting C's.
Yeah.
But let's now see who goes up a little higher, right? And that's what we have in this is I sometimes jokingly say that large language, especially general large language models, are 60% right 100% of the time, right? So
No, exactly. And then there are issues there about how much you need to internalize yourself, memorize yourself. A lot of learning and exams in our current system is about because that is about, if you like, tweaking someone else's essay rather than having got the foundational skills of your own essay. So there's a lot of people in education would find some of that quite controversial. So it's quite interesting how we use these things, isn't it?
It's interesting. It's different. And and we've done this, right? History will show us that we've done this in the past, right? When calculators were invented, we thought that was the end, right? Like we now don't have to add numbers. We don't have to multiply, blah, blah, blah. But actually what it's done is it's increased the level of maths that children are able to learn and the level that they're able to get to, right? And I think we have to think the same way. Like, I don't think that it removes the ability to think critically or to add creativity and introspection and have a perspective and a point of view. But I think it starts from a different starting point.
So what are the couple of things that you would want changed in our education system based on everything we've been talking about that you think would make a big difference to boys?
So I think we need to be balanced in our approach to how we encourage children to do more. And I think that gender shouldn't play a role in that, and I think it's difficult, right? But I think we have to be mindful that without that balance between we should have the same expectation about our class, we're going to end up in a place like we are now. So that would be, I guess that's my first thing. And then the second one is what I said earlier, which is we've got to remember that, we've got a lot of things right as well, in the face of, these new technologies, and what they're kind of making us face and look at, and the world looks different and everything. I think it's easy to say everything I knew yesterday doesn't count anymore, but I think that's wrong. We have a huge amount of experience. There is a lot that history can teach us about what we're going through. And so I think we have to remember that our school systems have gotten a lot right. There's space for improvement, but we can't throw it all away and start again. We don't need to.
Brilliant. And have you got a role model for us that you would recommend for boys and young men?
I have I got one. I mean, I've the role models that come to mind for me, tend to be, people like Barack Obama, or Oprah Winfrey, like big figures who've done lots of different things, philanthropic as well as, incredible achievements in their lives. But I think we have to come down a level from that, and think about what is it that's touching boys and men today, and can we help put people in that space, just like we have over the last decades with girls, showing them that life in different sectors, in different types of success, is possible for all different types of people. And I think that's what they're missing right now. They are not seeing that enough, because we've concentrated so much, and rightly so, on showing women that, and girls, that there are women in these roles. We've missed doing that for boys. And I don't think it's hard to do. We just haven't been showcasing it.
Sana Khareghani, thank you very much. It's
Thank
been
you
great
very
talking
much.
to
It was
you.
wonderful to talk to you about this.